When I think of popular bikes from the 1980s, there's a few that spring to mind. Brands like BMW, Ducati and Harley had some bikes of note, but it was the land of the rising sun that really dominated the decade in what was a golden era for the Japanese motorcycle industry. Innovative engineering, cutting-edge design and unrivaled performance converged to create an iconic wave of Japanese bikes. With the Suzuki Katana, the Yamaha VMAX and the Honda RC30, Japanese manufacturers left a lasting mark on the motorcycle industry during the decade, and in my opinion, no bike epitomises this more than the Kawasaki GPZ900R. So grab your aviators while we take a look at this awesome bike from the decade that also gave us fashion classics like acid wash jeans, men's pastel suits and the original mullet. Back in its day, the Kawasaki GPZ900R was a real statement in engineering. With its sleek lines, it looked like no other bike on the road at the time. It was and still is a bike that makes your heart race and your senses come alive. Back in the late 1970s, the good people at Kawasaki desperately wanted to produce a sub 1000cc bike to replace the legendary Z1. Not wanting to get pipped at the post again by a rival, Kawasaki developed the GPZ900R in secret over 6 long years. And using the lessons learned from the original Z1 development, they came up with a bike that truly shook up the market. And finally, in 1984, the GPZ900R was released and continued in production in some countries until 2003. It was also the first bike, and in my opinion, the best bike in the Kawasaki lineup to be given the Ninja name. It was very well received by the press back in 1984 and sold in good numbers, with reviewers and owners alike loving the performance, the handling and the modern design. A claimed top speed of 100 miles per hour was a major selling point, and one of the reasons 3 versions of the bike were entered in the Isle of Man production TT, but the GPZ900R is probably most famously known as the bike that Pete Maverick Mitchell rode in the 1984 film Top Gun, and this is why it's such an iconic bike for Gen Xers like myself. The GPZ900R was a revolutionary bike when it was released. It had a 908cc 16-valve inline 4-cylinder engine with a double overhead camshaft. It was also liquid cooled and produced 115 brake horsepower at 9,500 RPM, so it screams along. Peak torque of 85 Newton meters was achieved at 8,500 RPM. It was quite a groundbreaking motorcycle when it was released, in that it was the first production motorcycle to feature a 16-valve liquid cooled engine. The engine was fed by 4 Cayenne CVK34 carburetors, and the exhaust was taken care of by 4x2 headers with a muffler on each side. It has 38mm telescopic forks that are air and oil damped. They are adjustable and feature Kawasaki's anti-dive technology. The front brakes feature a twin disc with Tokino floating calipers. It has a dual-sided swing arm and an adjustable air oil shock absorber with a single piston disc on the rear. One thing that I found really interesting, but it was apparently pretty standard for the time, is that the front wheel is smaller than the rear. So it has a 16-inch rim on the front and an 18-inch on the rear. It has a 22-litre fuel tank with a 4-litre reserve, is 228 kilograms dry and has a low seat height of 780 millimeters. It's a thirsty beast, and I also noticed that it was very fussy about which fuel was used. Sometimes it would feel like it was getting a little bit bogged. Apparently this was a pretty common issue that was more likely due to the carburetors getting clogged or dirty, which would lead to poor performance. And I suppose this is understandable in a bike that's nearly 40 years old. But give it a chance to clear its throat and the GPZ900R would roar along at a very brisk pace. On the plus side, the handling on the GPZ900R is great. That smaller 16-inch front wheel does make a massive difference. Just point the bike where you want it to go and it's away. It's not going to match the top spec electronically adjustable and controlled modern machines, but the handling for a 40-year-old bike is actually pretty good. It's got a sporty chassis design and is responsive to rider input. All up, it's a fairly confidence-inspiring bike to ride. Its aerodynamic fairing, single headlight and sporty styling make it a really distinctive bike that in my opinion still looks great today, although maybe that's just me being nostalgic. When first throwing a leg over the GPZ900R, one thing I did notice was that it seemed quite a reach to the bars, and my first thought was, I'm too old for this shit. But after riding it for about 10 minutes or so, I found the comfort level was actually pretty good, and somehow the reach to the handlebars seemed quite natural and certainly not uncomfortable. In fact, the GPZ900R is a bike that you could do some pretty big kilometres on. Now, in the late 90s, I relocated from Sydney to the Gold Coast for work for about 12 months. With no car, my only transport was my trusty GPX 600R. So I packed up some essentials, my toothbrush, my Discman, and a copy of the latest Blink 182 CD. If you're my age, I'm sure you know the album cover. I did that trip up and back at least 3 times, and twice covering the near 1,000 kilometres in a day. It was a bike that was a reasonable sports tourer, but I know the GPZ900R would have simply swallowed up those kilometres. Riding the Kawasaki GPZ900R is quite an experience, but it's not just the raw power that makes it so special. For its time, the bike was a masterpiece of engineering with advanced suspension, brakes and handling that provided a level of control and precision that are unparalleled. Every twist of the throttle, every lean into a curve is a symphony of grace and control. This is another classic that I would simply love to have in the garage. It's got a cool factor that for many riders like myself represents the golden era of sports tourers. It's no surprise that mentioning the GPZ900R brings back fond memories for those who've experienced or longed for one in its heyday. It's a symbol of an era when motorcycles were pushing boundaries and capturing the imagination of riders around the world. The throaty exhaust snarls, the acceleration is adrenaline-inducing. It's a true speed demon capable of reaching amazing velocities with agility and relative ease. It's yet another Kawasaki that makes your senses come alive. This is another classic that I would simply love to have in the garage. But it's not the best, in my opinion, from Kawasaki's early days. That honour belongs to the legendary Kawasaki Z1, which is featured in this video over here, so check it out.